Good afternoon. My name is Lisa von der Heide, and together with my colleague Hannah, we'll be speaking about parametric solutions for disaster risk financing today. I know that innovative financing solutions have been an important part of the discussions here already over the last 2 or 3 days. So today we will speak about one special element of innovative financing and disaster risk reduction, which is parametric solutions. And I know it's a tough time to be listening to us after lunch break, so please feel free to enjoy your coffee while we talk. And we'll have a very quick agenda. We'll be speaking about what social impact partners is. Then we have several examples of parametric solutions that we would like to present to you. And then we have time for questions. So to give you a broad overview of what Social Impact Partners is, it's a consultancy, a financial consultancy based in Munich and Johannesburg. And we work with partners or clients from the humanitarian sector, from the development sector, and from the public sector. So all kinds of social innovators out there working in disaster risk reduction. So we work with our partners at any stage of developing such solutions. They can be very early stage that we speak about defining the database on parametric solutions, but it can also be that somebody comes to us and knows exactly what he's looking for, and we help in structuring, for example, ecosystem-based adaptation solutions or social impact bond solution, insurance closed solutions like guarantee facilities and others. So the aim of those financial innovations is really paying on to the 17 SDGs. And we realized over the last years that our focus tend to have an impact on SDG 13, mainly, so many of them pay on to the climate action goals, because we enable our partners and clients to have funding available right when they need it. So right after a catastrophe or even before in focus-based financing approaches, or to release capital that is currently locked in so-called emergency funds, for example, to release this very early and even before usual post-disaster donations flow in. So to jump right into our topic which we have today, we would like to start from the challenges that arise after disasters. So we'll focus on disasters from meteorological disasters, hydrological, climatological, and geophysical disasters. And they can have an impact on the organization's funding. For example, on the volatility of the funding that is available. So if an organization has an emergency fund, for example, and it was planned to be dispersible for 4 events, for example, and then there are more events than that, or smaller or bigger ones, it is not really easy to plan. So disasters are not easy to plan with. Sometimes the lack of data is also a big problem, so which is why we work together with partners from the private sector as well, with several insurers, with brokers, and we have access to different networks and data that we can use to structure that kind of solutions. A crucial element, which is also one that I will be focusing on in the first example that we'll give, is the availability of funding right after a disaster. So the first example I would like to talk about is the emergency funding availability, because funding gaps can arise in case of an accumulation of events. I'm sure you're all aware that if an organization works with an emergency fund, which is, for example, 10 million US dollars, and then an emergency like the cyclone Idai happens in March this year, so it was a 10 million US dollars in January only. Then in March, the first cyclone in Mozambique hit. it would decrease by 4 million US dollars, for example, then only 6 million would be left. If the same happens again, or in another cyclone when Kenneth hit in April, and you need another 3 million, then it decreases again, and there's only 3 million left at today's date. So what happens if another 2 or 3 or other events in the same region happen, which the emergency fund was forecasted for? And we're not even a half year through yet. And imagine something happens in July this year, then you would have a funding gap. So I'm sure many of you have experienced this, that funding gaps arise even early in the year. So what do? There are many different options, and today we'll talk about a parametric solutions to stabilize this fund, so to decrease the volatility of this fund. You could, for example, establish a sort of parametric solutions in January when you hit off the financial year with the emergency fund. You could establish a parametric solution. It's called parametric because obviously you use parameters that define at which threshold a cover, a financial risk transfer, pays out to support you and to make funding available after a disaster. So if, for example, in January 2019, the emergency fund starts at 10 million US dollars, and you invest some of it into a risk transfer, which means that this risk transfer pays out at clearly defined incidents. So if this risk transfer would work for, let's say, cyclones in a specific region, then this year, this is what would have happened. The first cyclone, Idai, hit in March. You would have needed those 4 million, which were on the last slide as well. And imagine all those things that were defined at the beginning of the year for this parametric solutions were hit. So this is when 4 million are actually totally covered by this risk transfer solution. Which means then in April, this emergency fund will still be available, reduced obviously by the premium which you paid in the beginning of the year. Then in April, when the second cyclone hit and you would need 3 million, then let's say not everything that you would need funding for is covered by the risk transfer solution. Let's say only 2.5 million is covered by the risk transfer solution because you need additional funding, let's say for an epidemic outbreak, which is not covered under this risk transfer solution. So this additional funding, which would be, for example, in this case, 0.5 million US dollar, would have to be covered out of the emergency fund. But that's no problem at that point of time because obviously you have enough funding available. So this is really a very simple structure, but it helps you to maintain an emergency fund at a certain level, and it prevents funding gaps from happening. So we brought another example, which also works with parametric solutions.
Okay, so let's move to a different topic and envision an endemic disease, for example. So let's look at malaria. So there are organizations, multilateral organizations like the Global Fund, for example, who have their programs in place to fight against those diseases. So their budget, their spendings on the basis of their expectations towards the development of such a disease. So, but what happens if there's an unexpected event? So there's a cyclone, there can be other natural disasters or even people movement, which can lead to an unexpected outbreak of such a disease. So what Lisa just said, it's the same case here. So then you have to raise additional capital, which might take time, so reaction is too late, which is really crucial in those situations. So the outbreak can even have a higher amplitude. Or you have to use emergency funding, which of course can then not be used for something else. So, which do I have to press? Green or? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so what can such an organization do, for example? So they can transfer this risk to the private sector. So it can be insurance company, for example. So there's multiple ways of looking at it. We just have 2 examples here. So one could be that there's a threshold defined saying, so if a certain case of malaria, so a number of cases is exceeded, then this cover will pay out. So the payment is triggered by a certain number of malaria cases in a specific region. So this money then can be used for effective vector control, or also for, of course, for malaria treatments. And if you have such a cover in place, you can ensure that the payments is there fast enough to prevent for any further outbreaks. The other solution, which is presumably a bit more complex, is that you define triggers or an index where influencing factors that can predict a potential outbreak. If they come together, then the cover pays out. So it can be also climate-related, so humidity, rainfall, also people movement could be included, which is a bit more difficult. So then these factors would be monitored over a certain period of time, and if this predefined trigger is hit, the cover kicks in, so the payment will be paid out by the insurance company. So this can be used for preventive action, for vector control, and can, in the very, very best case, an outbreak can be avoided, or the amplitude of the outbreak can be decreased. So, if in a perfect world, when those mechanisms work, you can actually increase efficiency and effectiveness. You have a higher planning reliability because the volatility is decreased. You can leverage available funding because you have to hold less reserves, because in the case of an unexpected event or a disaster happening, the insurance cover will kick in. And of course, in that case, you can reach more people, and you can decrease the cost of inaction because you enable rapid response. So you can, in the best case, you can avoid snowball effects. But this all sounds a bit like magic. Of course, it's not that simple, right? So, and we have to be really honest about that. There's limits to these kind of solutions. There's always, if you put something like this in place, there's the risk that a disaster happens and there's no payout, because the trigger is defined in the wrong way. Also, there's of course a situation which we've experienced in the past, that there's action in vain. So there's a payment triggered, and the catastrophe in the end doesn't materialize. So it has to be looked at very thoroughly. There has to be a clear value proposition, because if money is paid to the private sector for such a solution, it has to make sure that the social impact is actually there. And that is what actually we stand for. So we're here to, thank you. We're here to really define clear value propositions. We are here to make sure that there's social impact in the end. So if you're interested in those topics, please come talk to us later on, and we're happy to discuss this. Thank you very much.